Hello English literature students. This is a PowerPoint lecture about one of the subgenres that we can talk about when we're thinking about In Cold Blood for paper 2, prose. Bear in mind we've also got the police procedural. So In Cold Blood, there are two subgenres you can think about at work. True crime is a genre you're probably all familiar with now. So I'm going to talk about what it's like now, what we now understand by the genre of true crime. It's a hybrid genre. It's part journalism, documentary, but it's also like crime fiction. And it's also like what we sometimes call novels of a state of the nation. That is a novel that wants to say something political, make a comment on what your country is like at the moment, often what the problems are with it. Now, true crime is usually seen as non-literary. Remember, sometimes we have a conversation about this. What is a literary text and what isn't? And true crime is very often put down as not literary. Lowbrow, which means the opposite of sort of high culture. It's seen as being purely entertainment. And partly this is because true crime fiction often focuses on violence and sex, as in sexual violence, which is seen as being sort of low taste. The writers of true crime will often claim to be writing for moral instruction. That will be their excuse. But the more these writers dwell on the sensationalist and the titillating details, the less convincing that argument is. Whereas something like In Cold Blood is using the conventions of true crime, but aiming to produce a literary work, so a highbrow work. What's the appeal? What are readers coming to true crime for? Well, one of the things that people think is why lots of readers like true crime is that reading about crime is safe yet thrilling. So it would not be thrilling to be involved in these sorts of crimes, but you're reading about them at home in your armchair, so it's a safe but thrilling. It's a bit like watching horror films. Often people say, why do people enjoy that? Similar possible explanation. Readers are able to participate vicariously, that is, at a distance. So you participate in a horrible crime, and also you get to feel moralistic, and you can go, oh, these terrible people, what a terrible crime. Literary true crime, like In Cold Blood, attempts to make reading about gory crime more respectable. So, we said on the last slide, it's seen as being lowbrow, sensationalist. So in an attempt to make it more respectable, there are a couple of things writers of literary true crime might do. Link the crime to a wider social issue in society, and therefore you can see that the text is critiquing social faults and problems, and that is seen as being a more highbrow activity to undertake. And then just the style of it, writing about crime in a novelistic way, taking care with your sentence forms and structures, your diction, your choice of words, how you create settings and atmosphere. Yep. Now, the image on the side there is a more recent literary true crime novel, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. I read it many years ago. It's a good read, I'm not going to lie. Okay, but now we're going to go back to the beginnings and think about the history of writing about true crime and of readers writing about true crime and how this made its way into the literary marketplace. Sorry about that rather gruesome image. It is a poor girl having her throat cut. But I did say violence and titillation and horror. So here are some of the very early works that are often cited. A work called The Lives of Remarkable Criminals, and this is from the 18th century, 1735. So if you remember, when we're talking about the Moonstone, this is the time of what we call the Bloody Code. This is when criminals are often executed, tortured, have their branded, things like this. And Lives of Remarkable Criminals recounted the lives, crimes and executions of 18th century lawbreakers. It was certainly meant to provide a moral warning and often had very moralistic comments within the stories, and to suggest that rather than a glamorous road of pleasure, the path taken by the criminal was merely the highway to the gallows. People in the 18th century, poor people, are really, really poor. Yeah, they might starve. So, you know, a life of crime could be seen as quite a tempting route to take. And then we also have what's called the Newgate calendar. The Newgate prison in London was where prisoners were held before being taken to execution. Remember, these are not necessarily murderers. You could be executed for a whole range of crimes, including just theft. And the Newgate calendar was published yearly and was biographies of the criminals held in the prison before their executions. And it was made up of what were originally single sheets sold at the public execution and purporting to contain the criminal's final words from the gallows. This was this very dramatic moment where the criminal would stand there, and sometimes they'd say, "Oh, don't be like me, don't follow this terrible life, look where it's led me." But other times they might say, "I defy you all." Yeah, I wouldn't change a thing. So it's very dramatic, and there's a big audience. Remember, public executions, big crowds there. And these criminals were not necessarily seen as villains or baddies by the crowd. And then throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a big vogue, very popular things called crime ballads. These are sometimes also called murder ballads, but they don't all be about murders. They were based on sensational cases, so often murder, and they were very popular. And how these were disseminated was a ballad singer would stand on the streets singing the ballad, and they would have the sheets to sell. So if you liked the song, you could buy it. It's like Spotify in the 18th century. It often adopted the criminal's perspective, so it would purport to be the voice of the criminal. So it used the first person. And that does kind of encourage the reader to identify with the criminal, and does suggest the audience are more interested in the criminal than their victims. So this example is the Mannings, I think a husband and wife, or maybe she was his mistress. Anyway, they got executed at Horsemonger Lane Jail. And because there's a woman involved, that always makes it more interesting to audiences as well. So let's get on to literary true crime. Now, here's a name we've heard before, Thomas de Quincy. He was the chap who wrote Confessions of an English Opium Eater. Really interesting writer. Didn't write fiction, didn't write poetry, just wrote non-fiction prose, but very literary, had a very good style. I'd recommend Thomas de Quincy. He's very good to read. And he wrote an essay called On Murder Considered as One of the Fine Arts. And it was published in a magazine in Edinburgh called Blackwood's Magazine, 1827. And it was a very literary take on crime. Now, some people looking for this history of where did In Cold Blood come from do mention this. It's a bit tentative, but there are some ways in which it's similar. And one of the true crime on which it's based, or which it refers to, many notorious British murder cases, but most perhaps infamously is what were called the Ratcliffe Highway murders. Ratcliffe Highway was the road, and a whole family was murdered in a house, and very bloody and horrible. Now, unlike In Cold Blood, this essay is satirical. It's a joke, and it's very black. The humour is very black. And it thinks about the psychology of the murderer, the victims and the witnesses in a way no author had attempted before. And throughout the speech, the fiction of this is that the chap writing it thinks murder should be considered like a fine art. So just as you could write about a painting and say what's brilliant about it, what's beautiful about it, you could talk about murders in this way. So he sees himself as a connoisseur of murder. So he calls the murderers artists. Be the artist, however, who he might, the affair remains a durable monument to his genius. So this is the aftermath of a really bloody murder. For such was the impression of awe and the sense of power left behind by the strength of conception manifested in this murder, that no tenant had been found since that time for Mrs. Ruscombe's house. So that gives you an idea of what he's doing in On Murder Considered as One of the Fine Arts. The next place we can look for true crime being popular as a literary, well, not literary form, as a printed form. There was a work published in the early 20th century called The Celebrated Criminal Cases of America, and it was by someone retired but who had been a police captain in San Francisco. And it has many, many features that have continued to be found in true crime writing. So this was just a compilation of famous crimes, including really brutal murders, and it had numerous photographs, and you can see on the side there a picture of some of the photographs of these criminals. And in the introduction, the writer gives the usual sort of excuse or explanation for true crime. While this volume will show that in some instances fabulous amounts of money have been unlawfully obtained, it will also show that retribution invariably overtakes the professional criminal and brings with it untold misery and degradation. So that's the moral story. So you get to read about the true crimes, but you also get to go, haha, they got punished. From the 1920s, true crime magazines were popular in America as well, and these very much were focused on photographs of the criminals' victims and crime scenes. Quite shocking today that the police allowed or didn't stop these photographers. They'd take close-ups of quite gruesome murder scenes, and this was sort of thing getting tabloid newspapers. Very popular but very distasteful. Photographs heighten the aura of reality, so important to true crime readers. They also create this sort of pathos because you see the victims and the killers in happier circumstances before the gruesome events. So the idea of literary true crime can be seen to start with a novel called An American Tragedy by a writer called Theodore Dreiser, and it fictionalized a true crime from 1906. So it's still not exactly like In Cold Blood because it still turns it to fiction, but it was very closely based on a real crime, which was infamous at the time. So a lot of readers would have recognised the crime on which this story was then based. A young man was found guilty of murdering his girlfriend, and what made it even worse was she was pregnant. And this is the idea of how this sort of true crime, literary true crime, is also a state of the nation novel, also links the crime to broader social changes and social problems. He didn't want to marry her. Often, a young man and a young woman would sort of go out with each other, but they wouldn't get married unless or until she got pregnant, and then you sort of had to. But he didn't want to marry her because in the meantime, he was courting a rich young woman who would help him climb the social ladder. So his murdering of his poor working class girlfriend in order to be able to carry on courting this more useful young woman to his career is made a metaphor for what's happening in America. And we can see how that's also something Capote does with the crime in Cold Blood.